Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2315. Our subject for the week is going to be life in the Neolithic period and the emergence of early civilizations. Really what we're looking at this week is some of the foundational things that needed to happen for human beings to start settling down in large urban centers. For human beings to start sort of congregating together and creating larger and larger societies. So in the textbook reading for this week, it covers sort of life inside of these four key river valleys in Afro-Eurasia, and then it also takes a look at life outside of these river valleys. Now, I am trying to keep this particular lecture kind of brief and short, and also you'll notice that I spent a lot of time talking about life in the Fertile Crescent in my PowerPoint lecture, and I talked a lot about Mesopotamia. I focus heavily on this because this will really be the last time that we're talking a lot about Mesopotamia as a whole. We might start looking at some individual societies that come out of that region of the world. But you'll notice if you're looking through our syllabus moving forward, we're going to spend time talking about the rise of the Egyptians and looking more acutely at what's going on in ancient Egypt and how they're structuring their society. I'm also intend to talk a little bit more in the future lectures about the Harappan communities that are found in northern India, the Indus River civilization. And so the same can be said about China, where we're going to look at the early state in China and really look. China's an interesting case in ancient world history because they're really one of the longest standing states that the borders are roughly similar to what they are today. And so we're starting to see that a centralized state is going to come out very, very early in China, one that we can trace from dynasty to dynasty moving forward. And so what you'll notice is I spend a lot of time on Mesopotamia, and then I kind of gloss over those other three river valleys because we will be talking about them in more detail as we move forward. So that's the way this lecture video is going to go as well. And as I said, I'd like to keep this rather brief and wrap it up quickly, just kind of hitting the highlights. And so when we're talking about this time period, we're talking about the Neolithic age. And the Neolithic period is the final phase of the Stone Age. And this is where human beings are producing smooth ground stone tools for a lot of different uses. They're using stone tools for hunting, grinding, butchering. They're using them pretty much for anything you could imagine. They're going to be starting to create some of these sorts of tools. And beyond that, they're going to take this a step further. Human beings are producing tools, but we're also going to see the foundations of engineering really taking shape during this particular time period. So the Neolithic period, which literally translates to the New Stone Age or the New Stone period, it began about 12,000 years ago and ended right around 4,500 before Common Era, what they used to call BC. So it ended about 6,500 years ago. Farming and agriculture emerged in the Near East a little bit before this period, but they really start to zone in and perfect their practices. Agricultural knowledge is there, the ability to grow and cultivate crops is there, but now we're going to see them doing this on a much grander scale. Human beings are going to start channeling water for irrigation. They're going to start using these river valleys that they're living in as a way to produce larger food surpluses and to really establish much larger populations. It is during the end of the New Stone Age or the Neolithic period that we start to see human beings engaging in metallurgy or metal making. This is going to be a major shift because the period we're going to be looking at immediately after the Neolithic is known as the Bronze Age. And as you can imagine, that's going to require the use of metals and metal production. So this period is really, really important in ancient world history, because this is the time period where we start to see this acute trend of human beings building their largest settlements, and they're doing this almost entirely along these great rivers of the Old World. So human beings are starting to focus on agriculture, and when they're doing this, they start to focus on living in fixed locations as well. Agriculture, because you're investing time and energy into producing a crop in a field, it makes you more sedentary. I'm not going to plant a bunch of seeds and then walk off 400 miles somewhere in the other direction and just leave all this time and resources that I've invested in the field. Once I've planted, I'm going to stick around until the harvest. And now I'm going to stay in that area full time. And so it's really no surprise that these human settlements, these earliest civilizations, almost universally emerge along the riverbeds. They're mostly living in river basins. Really, it's floodplains that start to become important during this time because human beings start taking the floodwaters and making it work to their benefit in terms of agriculture. So that's really what we're looking at today in the overall subject. That kind of gives you the background. Now, I do want to talk for a few minutes about why we're looking at rivers in these great river basins. And as I've said, almost universally, these early human settlements will start to appear along the rivers. We know from our last lecture that human beings are following water wherever they go. We need water no matter where we're at. It's a major necessary component of life. I can go almost a month without eating food and I'll find a way to survive. You got about 2 to 3 days without water and you're pretty much dead. And so it is no surprise that human beings, their migratory patterns follow the rivers, they follow water, and it's no shock that they settle along water. The rivers are providing fresh drinking water for these newly settled inhabitants. A lot of societies, they try to go along the coastal territories, and these societies tend not to take very well. Because when you dig down into the ground and you try to get into the water table to tap it for drinking water, you end up with salt water if you're too close to the coast. So that's why the rivers are a far preferable place for settlement. When you tap down into the water table to try to produce drinking water, you actually get clean water that you can use. Secondly, these rivers are being used to irrigate crops and fields. That's the biggest part of all of this. When we look at Mesopotamia, it's all about the people living in between these two rivers, where they're taking water from the rivers and channeling it into their crops, into their fields. It's what allows them to be very, very successful agriculturalists on a scale that allows them to start building these grand cities. Using that for irrigation and to sort of work with your crops, rechanneling that water is a critical component of living along these rivers. Finally, we have the production of agricultural products and the people who are producing them. Now, what we're talking about here is a food surplus. These aren't people planting enough crops to feed themselves and their families. So that should tell you something else about what these people are thinking. They're not growing it just for themselves, they're growing it for the wider society. That tells us they're growing it to sell to other people. If you're going to sell something, you need to be able to move it. Most people are not going to walk out to your farm to buy crops. You need to move these crops to a central market. You need to move these foodstuffs into a place where they can be easily sold to other people. And so they're also using these rivers for transportation and transit. They're moving goods and products down these rivers. And this is going to give rise to long-distance trading. This is a major shift in human civilizations because it starts to become abundantly clear that if you settle in one area and let's say you focus on growing something like cereal grains, like they're growing in Mesopotamia, that's fine if you want to bake bread. It's good if you want to make a porridge that's highly nutritious, but you need more than that. And if your sole focus is just growing crops and growing cereal grains, you also need protein in your diet. You also need fiber from other types of vegetation. You need somebody else to be doing these other jobs, and you're going to trade for what you don't have. This becomes much larger and more sophisticated when the distance trade patterns start following these rivers. What you're going to see is precious metals like gold and bronze, as we're going to see later, start getting dug out of the earth and traded. Precious stones, one of the ones they talk about a lot in the textbook is lapis. That's a major trade commodity in the early world. And so you're seeing it's mostly being produced in sort of the area that today we would call Pakistan and India. And the Harappan culture makes good money producing these stones. They use them domestically, but then what they don't use domestically, they sell it to other parts of the world. And what they're going to get for that is something that will make their society more robust. They're going to buy something that they don't produce. And so it starts to create these very intricate networks of trade all over the old world. And so this is why these riverbeds and these river basins are really important to the development of human civilizations and societies. The areas that we look at your textbook talks about, and that I discuss or at least briefly touch on in lectures this week, we have 4 great river basins. The first, as I mentioned, is Mesopotamia. This is the area in what we would call the Near East between the Tigris and Euphrates River. So it sort of runs through the entire floodplain, goes all the way from the Mediterranean coast down to as far south as the Indian Ocean. And so we actually have this big crescent-shaped area, what they call the Fertile Crescent, emerging between these two rivers, and that's where we see the earliest settled large societies and cities taking shape. The second area we're going to look at is Egypt, and obviously, I think as most of you know, that society is going to emerge entirely along the banks of the Nile River. The Nile River being the longest river in the world, it stretches all the way from the Central African highlands, areas around, like Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, basically, the big mountainous range that runs in the rift along East Africa. And you have the Blue Nile and the White Nile come together right around Khartoum in modern-day Sudan. And it goes all the way up to the Mediterranean coast where it discharges. The Nile Delta is up along the Mediterranean coast, and that'll be an important part of human civilization and settlement in that area of North Africa. Then we're going to turn our attention briefly to the area along the Indus River Valley in northern India and Pakistan. And so that is where we have the Harappan or the Indus River culture. They're going to be a very interesting sort of group because they build a little bit differently than what we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And their society takes on a slightly different social structure. And that'll actually translate when we start to look at the beginnings of religion in this area of the world. We have Hinduism as one of the oldest religions that we can trace linearly back to its foundations. And a lot of that is based on the emergence of early writing in that civilization, and it also is built around these sort of urban cultures that are coming up along the Indus River. So, finally, we're going to briefly look at some developments in China along the Yangtze and Yellow River. And so when we look at that area, you're going to see, again, each one of these areas, they're all following the same basic trajectory towards society building, but there's little nuances, caveats, and differences between each one of these groups. And what we're seeing in these societies. So we're going to go through them in that order and talk briefly about each one of these particular areas. So we'll start with Mesopotamia. The name itself, Meso means in the middle, and Potamia means between two rivers, or basically two rivers. And so Mesopotamia in Greek translates to the land between two rivers. And that should always remind you that we're talking about the area in between the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is an area that we historically have called the Fertile Crescent, because there is a habitable, agriculture-friendly belt, or crescent-shaped sort of region, that is formed by the confluence of these two rivers and the floodplains that exist between these two. So, it's in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia that the first human city emerges and takes shape. This is a city that's known as Uruk. Uruk was established along the Euphrates River in the southern part of Mesopotamia. They're kind of off of a tributary that feeds the Euphrates. And the city actually reached its zenith, or its highest point of growth, right around 3500 BCE. So they are pretty prominent right up until about 3000 BCE. And you can see that when we start to excavate some of these cities in Mesopotamia, we're seeing the existence of really large temples, public meeting spaces, a royal palace. And we know that this area probably boasted a population of about 10,000 people. That is a massive human settlement, because when you look just outside of the city, when you look to the deserts and the areas that are not as deeply inhabited as this Fertile Crescent, you're looking at populations of about 40 to 50 people. And so you can see there's a huge discrepancy between 10,000 and 40,000. So, or 40 people, sorry, not even 40,000, 40 to 50 individuals. So there's this big difference between these sizes of these groups. And what that, again, I always have to take it back to a food surplus. If you can maintain a population of 10,000 people, and we know you have specialists who are going to not just be building these large temples, but also the priest class that's going to be running the religious structures of this society, we know there are people who are not having to produce their own food. Somebody else is producing enough food to take care of them. And that's what this large population is telling us about Uruk. So the city maintained rather strong defenses. They started to build these high walled fortifications around the city. And a branch of the Euphrates runs right down the center of the city. And so that provides good drinking water, sanitation, and easy transportation to the inhabitants of Uruk. So, Uruk is the first of many cities. There's overall, the archaeologists and historians tend to say there's about 35 major cities will emerge in this period in Mesopotamia. And this is why we call it the birthplace of civilization, is that very rapidly a lot of states start to emerge, a lot of cities start to emerge in this area of the world. And so we're going to stick with this conversation surrounding Mesopotamia because this is going to really highlight how cities have changed humanity at this point in the civilization and the growth of the species. So, due to the growth of distance trading, cities start to become the production centers of the ancient world. After Uruk, a lot of other cities start popping up in Mesopotamia. And within a really short period of the first cities coming about, they start to become the epicenters of commerce, religion, and political power in Afro-Eurasia. So we're not talking about just money centers. We're not just talking about New York City as it is today or Los Angeles. These are places that maintain lots and lots of authority, not just for the people living in them, but for the people living in the immediate surrounding area as well. So the religions of these cities grew by leaps and bounds, and people started actually coming to the cities because they believed in the deities that were being worshipped there. The temples were located in the cities. And so the people who are maybe not part of the city proper, they start pouring into the city because it's seen as the religious center. Obviously, people will start flocking into these cities because there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of resources to be had. And as kind of a common trend in history, as I always say, if you follow the money, you're going to find the truth of what's going on in history. People have always been driven by resources. They've always been driven by power represented by wealth. And so the fact that these become the hubs for trading is also going to become a very important aspect of these cities. And then finally, political power. When you have all these people clustering together and lots of people, different people living in these, and diverse types of people living in these very small areas, it requires centralized authority. In other words, it's pretty easy in a class of 10 people to take a vote and figure out what everybody wants to do, to have a discussion surrounding something that pertains to the class. I've got to get the opinions of 9 other people, put my opinion out there, and then find some consensus between these 10 opinions. That's not a very difficult thing to do. For 10,000 people, I don't get to take votes anymore. I don't have to listen to everybody in the class. I don't have time, and most of the people aren't going to have a strong opinion anyway. And so the attitude then I become a dictator in the class. I become a iron-fisted ruler, a tyrant, a despot, a king, an emperor, something like that. So I'm going to make a decision for all 10,000 people in my class. I don't have time to listen to what you all want, and frankly, there's going to be too many conflicting opinions anyway. And so I'm not going to listen, I'm just going to tell you what you all need. And that's the way that leadership starts taking place in the cities. That's the way that political power gets vested. It becomes more centralized, going in a hierarchy, usually to a king. And then that king naturally is going to want to expand his authority and bring it out over a larger area, expand the city, grow its borders outward, conquer the people living in neighboring territories. That's how their power is being vested in one person in a city. So, ultimately today, a large percentage of, I think over 50% of our population lives in what we could call urban settlements. But this is a relatively new development when we look back to this time period in the Neolithic era. And it comes with a lot of changes towards how human beings are living. First, human beings are no longer in a natural environment. They're living in a man-made environment. This has a lot of benefits. Number one, your shelters are permanent, so once it's built, it's less time consuming. You're not walking around like a nomad putting up a tree bark and stick hut every time you stop. You've built yourself a home, sometimes out of mud, sometimes out of bricks, sometimes out of stone. But You've built a permanent settlement and you'll be there for an extended period of time. It's easy to sort of defend yourself in these cities. As the old adage goes, there's power in numbers. And so living in urban centers and in cities gives you this ability to more easily defend yourself from animal attack and from attack from other humans and outsiders. It gives you some level of defense versus inclement weather. And ultimately, goods and products are produced right there and they're easily accessible. Anything that's produced by the society is sold in a central market, and you have access to other exotic goods that have come from abroad. Those are all the benefits of living in a city. But there's always drawbacks. There's two sides to every coin. And there's other problems that come within this sort of urban pattern of living, this clustering together. First and foremost, you're going to have big groups of people all living close to one another. This is not a good thing when it comes to, as we're seeing today, particularly with the COVID thing. Disease spreads a lot more quickly in city centers than it does in a rural, spread out area. Everyone's breathing on each other, living right next to each other, sweating on top of each other. You're going to have disease spread starts to become pretty rampant right away. Secondly, poverty becomes a problem. People flood into the cities looking for economic opportunities, but there's never enough to go around. So you start to see poverty become a major problem. You have serious problems with issues like pollution and sanitation. These early cities are exceptionally dirty. We're not talking about a clean running water sanitation system that they have set up. People are going to be living in their own filth in a lot of ways inside of these cities, and that's a problem as well. And finally, there's more and more research coming out these days talking about the psychological impact of a detachment from natural environments. It's something that we in this nation and in the Western world have recognized for some time. Here in our own home city of Houston, they're building lots and lots of parks and green spaces. That's because they've done studies that show when people are living in an entirely urban environment with no access to nature or anything natural, this leads to a sharp sort of rise in mental health problems. So we're starting to see that you would have people that back then they would simply label as lunatics, but people who had serious mental health diseases started popping up in these cities as well. And that's just a product of completely being detached from the natural world. And so today we try to counter that, like you go to New York City and they build things like Central Park. We have our areas here like TC Jester Park, Memorial Park, Memorial Herman Park. All of these areas are designed to give urban dwellers who are living in these concrete jungles an opportunity to get back to nature and sort of reconnect with grass, with trees, with animals. And so get out of that urban environment for some relief. So ultimately, a vast majority of the city's inhabitants, again, are not producing their own food. They're relying on the production of a food surplus within the city. That leads to increased specialization, and that's what makes these cities so unique and different from the natural environment. When human beings start to specialize, we are capable of doing amazing things. When people start looking at engineering, they start figuring out how to take a river, take river water and dig a trench for it to rechannel it towards fields and become better food producers. When you have specialization, you have the ability to start building out really, really intricate and innate cosmologies or religions that people are going to follow. Large numbers of people are going to start listening to the structure and the rules of these religions. So there you get the rise of a priestly class. If you're concerned about defense and warfare, you can have an entire group of people whose sole purpose in your society is to do nothing but kill. They are professional soldiers. And so you start training a warrior class. You start developing a political class who's going to start making rules and things that will transform into laws for these societies. You're going to start to see that people engage in intellectual pursuits. As I often use it as an example, no one's got time. I am not sitting here talking about history if my wife and my kid and myself are starving. I'm going to go out and try and produce some food. So people start thinking about things like history, philosophy, political realities as part of that. That is a type of philosophy. They're going to look at a lot of these different types of things. They're going to start producing art. They're going to work on woodworking and carpentry. They're going to start producing metals. Metallurgy is the result of specialization. Someone had the time, because he didn't have to feed himself, to sit around and play with molten metal until he's able to turn it into something usable. So ultimately, what you're starting to see here is that this is creating the sort of things that we look at as hallmarks of human society. Specialization is humanity. That's what makes us different from other animals and other creatures and species around the planet. That's what makes us really different from them. So Mesopotamia is really the heartland of all of these developments and these changes. They start building on their entire these big cities. They start building on these big cities, and they start dominating trade. And the reason that this area is good is not just because of the fact that they're living in this floodplain between two rivers, that agriculture's good, everything's going well in terms of water, but it's also location. They're right at the epicenter of the Old World. Southwest Asia is the crossroads for North Africa, for things coming from East Asia, for trade products moving in and around the Mediterranean. It all ends up in that central hub right there. And so there's this idea of location, location, location. Because Mesopotamia is in such a strategically important spot, it is the natural center of trade in the Old World. So that is a really, really important factor that we're seeing take shape here. Is this idea that population density is going to get big there. More and more people are going to start flooding in there because trade is also producing these opportunities. And that drives this process of urbanization. We start to see right around 2500 BCE, urbanization is becoming the very, very quick growing and normative fad within Mesopotamia. So the priest class will emerge in the cities. They're bringing people into the city centers. Commerce is bringing people in. The power of strong rulers is bringing people in. And these city-states start to pop up all over the place. And that's what a city-state is really all about. We're going to see city-states again and again and again in early human history. What this is the idea of a city-state is it's a type of political organization. And it basically is the city is the governing power for a far-reaching territory wide around the city. So basically, to give you a modern day analogy, Houston is hands down the biggest city in southeastern Texas. And so we might say if Houston ran everything that happened in southeastern Texas, from Beaumont up to Conroe, over on the west, go to Lake Houston, all of these areas around would be dominated by the politics and the decision-making processes happening in Houston. That Houston would be a city-state. And everything in this wide-reaching territory around Houston would be part of the Houston city-state. That's what it would be called. And so these cities start to become so big that the political authority extends beyond the boundaries of the city, beyond the walls of the city itself. And this is the emergence of a new sort of political organization known as the city-state. So that is going to be a key sort of hallmark of what's going on within these cities. Now, this sort of is an undercurrent that runs in the next discussion that we're going to have. And that is ornamentation and sort of the grandiose way that they built these cities. This goes a long way towards the growth of human societies as it comes to playing on people's psyches. There's a bit of psychology going on here with the way they built these cities. It's one thing to build a city. I got a lot of people. We're all clustering together. Does that really make it a city, or are we just a very large village? If you were going to become the center of political life for not just the people in the city, but everybody around it, if you're going to become the center of religious life, of commercial life, then the facade of the city needs to reflect your important position within the region. And so it's not just enough to build a city, you need to build it on a grand or wondrous scale. And that's why we see a lot of the monument building, a lot of the sort of artistic output and creation of these early civilizations. You might wonder, why is a civilization that's just getting on its feet building a structure that we wouldn't even try to build today, like the pyramids? like the ziggurats or temples that you see all over Mesopotamia. And the reason for that is these cities are meant to be a beacon to everybody living around them. We are the most advanced. We're the most civilized of all civilizations. We have achieved something that nobody ever thought was possible. You're living out in a little two-bit flea-infested village. I'm building a grandiose temple that you can see for 5 miles around. It reminds you out in the rural areas, I'm in charge. I'm the guy who has power. I'm the one who's great. I command the power of armies. I control building in this city. And don't forget it because I just built a 40-foot statue of myself to remind you how amazing I truly am. And that reinforces the political idea, the political structure that's going on in this area of the world. And so, this is meant to influence everybody living in and around the city. Don't forget who built this place. Don't forget who's in charge here. I built that temple. I built the giant monument to myself. My mausoleum where I'm going to be buried is going to be the biggest thing that you'll be able to see in this city. It's going to be part of the skyline. It's so big. And so we start to see a lot of this development of human architecture and artistic output is the result of psychological ideology. We're trying to basically show everybody around us we're grand, we're powerful, we have more resources, more know-how, and more manpower to get these kinds of big construction projects done because we're better than everybody else. And so why wouldn't you want to come live in my city? Why wouldn't you want to be part of my state? I'm obviously a great ruler. Look what I've achieved. And so that's what that monument building in early society is really all about. So there is always going to be conflict within these city-states. Mesopotamia is, and I don't expect you all to get into the rise and fall of individual Mesopotamian states until we start highlighting them in lectures. But it would basically be constant endemic warfare. By the 4th millennium BCE, the south of Mesopotamia began to urbanize and started growing more powerful. About a one millennia later, in the 3rd millennia, you see northern Mesopotamia really quickly catches up with their southern neighbors. They start to become grand societies and building very, very large states as well. So, warfare between these city-states is nearly constant. It's endemic. Powerful city-states are always looking to overrun or destroy or gain control of the neighboring city-state. If I've got a lot of power, I've got a lot of authority, I'm probably not okay to just stop and let it rest where it is. I want what you have as well. And I'm going to take your city and make my city-state even bigger and even greater. And this would lead to the creation of a different type of political structure, what they call the territorial state. These are states that are sizably bigger than a city-state. And what it ultimately means that one ruler or one political entity has control over many urban centers. Lots of little different city-states, they all combine together to make a territorial state. They're all brought together under one ruler or one political structure. And the example that's given of this in your textbook is the world's first great conqueror, in quotes, a guy named Sargon the Great. He was an Akkadian ruler from the Mesopotamian city of Akkad. And he reigned between 2354, sorry, I think it's 2334 BCE. I got to get my date straight. And 2279 BCE. That's when he reigned. And so this guy is a very, very powerful ruler. And he was able to gradually grow his influence with the creation of a standing professional army. He would go and invade other territories and take them over. He invaded southern Mesopotamia and was actually able to unify all the city-states there. This starts a trend that we're going to see a lot when we look at the growth of empires and the growth of these big civilizations. They use a basic sort of premise, which is I'm more powerful, I'm better equipped, and you'd have to join me. And what they're going to do is they'll march into a city and say, look, you've got one of two choices. You can either join me and be a part of this alliance and pay tribute to me, or I can crush you and take everything I want anyway and just get rid of you. And so a lot of these smaller city-states don't have the ability to fight a guy like Sargon the Great back, so they're just going to join him. But what we do also see is Sargon the Great unifies this area of southern Mesopotamia under his power. But less than 100 years after he dies, marauders from the desert all invade his capital in the city of Akkad and actually lead to the collapse of this burgeoning Akkadian empire. And so it's important to remember we're going to be talking today all about city states, territorial states, the building of these cities. There's still a majority of people who are not living in them, and those people living outside of the cities can affect serious historical change as well. They are still very, very active players in the history that we're talking about. And we can see that with the Akkadian Empire in its ultimate collapse at the hands of marauding desert dwellers who have nothing to do with this process of urbanization and city building. So, I'm going to summarize everything we've been talking about with Mesopotamia. And it's important to do this because, like I said, I'm basically going to gloss over the other three societies that are brought up in the textbook in depth, because we're going to deal with them again later. But everything I'm about to summarize about Mesopotamia, for the most part, can be applied to these other civilizations that we're talking about. And it's something that it's happening at different time periods and maybe in a little bit different way, but it's still the same process. So really, when I talk about those other river valleys, I'm simply going to talk about what makes them different from Mesopotamia. But the Fertile Crescent, when we're going to sum this area up, it's in this region that human beings accomplish the following. Number one, they produce irrigation for their crops. They start actually working with civic and agricultural engineering to produce larger food surpluses. They start to create larger settlements. They create settlements bigger than 1,000 people for the first time in human history. They start building these very elaborate cities, something we've been talking about, and that goes hand in hand with monument building. They have creative output in terms of art, architecture. They have the oversight of long distance trade networks, something that's going to be critical in not just helping people get rich, but also unifying and creating connectivity in this old world setting. They're also going to see, and it's something I'm not going to talk a lot about, but your textbook hits on this. This is where the origins of written language start to occur, and this is where we start shifting from prehistory to history, what is actually the field of historians. When they start writing stuff down, that's when we really become interested as historians. So that's where they leave us their documentary records, and we're going to start to see lots of different forms of writing coming out of this part of the world. They also establish these more complex and sort of intricate political units, the city-state and the territorial state. So clearly, this is the region of the world that contributes really greatly to the general construction of human societies. Here we're seeing the birthplace of civilization as it really occurs. The economic arrangements we're used to seeing, political structures that we're familiar with, material culture that we're used to seeing in the ancient world. It is all born in Mesopotamia. So that wraps up our discussion on the Fertile Crescent. And like I said, I'm going to briefly touch upon what's going on in the Nile River, then the Indus River Valley, in areas between the Yellow and Yangtze River in China. So the Nile River is the longest river in the world, and it is around the Nile that we'll see the rise of Egyptian civilization, something I'll be talking about a little later. But an identifiable Egyptian culture, what we can see is their language, their sort of belief systems, they're all starting to take shape during the third millennia BCE. So this is a massive land empire. They united nearly 600 miles along a stretch of the Nile River under the control of a single ruler eventually, somebody called a pharaoh, something we'll talk a little bit about. But just like in Mesopotamia, the Nile River Basin is what's giving rise to the growth of cities here. Now, it's a different scenario, though. The Nile River is a little more unpredictable, and it has far less cultivatable land than what we see in the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is a massive area where you can undertake agriculture between two rivers. The Nile and Egypt, it's not the same way. The Nile is a single river in what they call Lower Egypt at that point in time, and it runs down before it splits into two rivers. But essentially, once you get outside of this river basin, so here I am following the Nile, I'm on its banks, and I got growth and habitable space. Go outside to here, and you're in desert. And so this is what makes the Nile a lot different from Mesopotamia, and it makes things a little bit more contestable, and it makes life a little more hectic in Egypt, because ultimately they are relying solely upon the Nile Delta for their food production. And this is the floodplain along the Upper Nile, and right situated right along the Mediterranean coast. And it's in this small region that they were able to grow all of the food to feed Egyptian society. And so they're relying upon a very small area that really is going to have to feed a ton of people. So the pharaohs are the ones in charge of this society. They're going to become the rulers, and they're really all about balancing internal fractures that we already see. This is a very, very hotly contested society. They have a dichotomous view of things in ancient Egypt. There's flooding versus drought, and that's the business of the pharaoh as well. The pharaoh is going to basically have to make sure the gods are happy, they're well propitiated, and then it's his responsibility to make sure the Nile floods when it's supposed to, and that they don't have a period of drought. That's all on this one guy. So there's also political fractures. There is a totally different culture in Lower Egypt than there is in Upper Egypt. And I know it's kind of backwards. We'll talk about this when we get to the ancient Egyptian hierarchy and the building of their society. Upper Egypt is technically in the south, down around south of Sudan, south of the Nile confluence coming together between the blue and the white. And Lower Egypt is actually the north, up along the Mediterranean coast, what we call Egypt today. So you also had this constant balance of keeping your citizens safe versus these desert marauders. So his goal is to maintain order in Egyptian society. The pharaohs are usually, that's what they're tasked with. And they intervene on behalf of their citizens with the deities. They're seen as semi deified living beings. So they represent a sort of theistic approach. They're not just political rulers; they're religious rulers as well. They carry religious authority. And so this is what makes Egypt very polytheistic, and something we're going to look at in another context in a later lecture. But you have lots of different deities, and the pharaohs are sort of responsible for keeping all these other deities in line. Now, what makes Egypt different from Mesopotamia? Why do we even have to distinguish it out at all? And why can't we just say this is what everybody was doing around rivers back then? So there are a few key features that make it different. Mesopotamians tended to build with mud brick. Their society was built out with a lot of this mud brick material. They're building vertically, they're building out horizontally, but they're not using the same material. Egyptians are building far more often with limestone. They're using actual hard stone surfaces. Another key difference in Egyptian society is that we don't see the same centralization of religion. Uh, Mesopotamia has these ziggurats. They're always at the center of the city. If you want to go to the temple, you're going to the center of the nearest city. That's how it works. In Egypt, it doesn't really work that way. They're spread out. They have lots of different gods, and every god had their own temple, and every city had its own god. And so you had this really fractured sort of religion. Every community had their own. You have a city there, what today is called Fayum in Egypt, used to be called Crocodilopolis, and that held a shrine to Sobek, the crocodile god. Bubastis was the site of Bastet, or the cat deity. Every one of these individual deities has their own cult, their own temple, and their own city. And so religious power is far more spread out in Egypt than what we see in Mesopotamia. Finally, burial chambers for the all-powerful and semi-divine pharaohs would become major spiritual and cultural centers. The the pyramids, obviously, is what we're talking about here. These become these really grandiose sort of structures that are going to become important hallmarks of Egyptian society. Finally, distance trade in Egypt is largely being carried on by boat, and the Egyptians are far more heavily invested in maritime and sea-based trade. You don't need to go out to the ocean if you're living in the Fertile Crescent. You can just move by land and in between the two rivers. With Egypt, they are pretty much relying solely on boat navigation up and down the Nile and then sailing around the coast of the Mediterranean as well. So, That's really all I have to say about ancient Egypt. Like I said, I'm kind of just glossing over this and talking about these things real briefly. And so the next subject we're on to now is the Indus River Valley civilization, what we often call Harappan culture. So here they're again emerging in the river basin of the Indus River, which is found, it runs through northern India and Pakistan. So it's right off to the west of the Himalayan mountains, this region. And villages started to emerge in this area right around 5,000 years ago. However, it's not really until about 2500 BCE that these villages start to turn into larger urban centers. And now the urban culture of the Indus River Valley is named after a city called Harappa. So we tend to call this entire civilization Harappan culture. Now, this is one thing I'm going to say about the Harappan culture. I'll get into it in a later lecture, too. We know less about these guys than any of the other civilizations that we look at in today's lecture. They just did not leave as much evidence. The climate there is not very conducive. Um, you have desertification of the area around Mesopotamia has led to dry, arid conditions that allow for, same thing in the Nile Valley. Everything's sort of dried up there. This is good for preserving stuff. Hot tropical environments like India, not so much. So, ultimately, what we're looking at is there is a sort of cause and effect relationship. What makes Harappan culture different, or the Indus Valley civilization, is that they're not developing entirely internally. There's a lot of influence coming from Mesopotamia. So, lots of migrants, when they do genetic tests of this area and of these cultures, what we're finding is that they're a mix of local people who are starting to form urban culture on their own, and then migrants from the Iranian plateau and the Mesopotamian region. So there are people moving into this region that are already familiar with city building, with these concepts that have emerged in Mesopotamia. They're importing a lot of this information down to northern India. And so just like Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Harappan culture is relying upon floodplains around the rivers in order to support their agriculture. And so they form these really large cities, establish very complex cultures around the river. So ultimately, this civilization tended to build with kiln-fired bricks. Actually, not really kiln-fired, with sun-fired bricks. And so rather than mud or stone. So that's what makes their construction style a little unique. They also achieved a working knowledge of irrigation and drainage. This society knew how to get water out too, not just bring it in. And there's even evidence that they might have had something like a sewer system, a fully functioning sewer system underneath their streets. So that's showing you a pretty sophisticated civilization for that time period right there. So the Harappan culture is really, really rich in natural resources. They have lots of gold, precious minerals, precious stones. They got this in abundance and they trade it all over the world. It's a very lucrative distance trade that they start to build out with places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now, the key difference between a Harappan culture and the Mesopotamians and Egyptians is that seems to be the absence of large burial chambers, temples, and royal palaces. In other words, we think that what we're seeing here is a more egalitarian society. We can't tell the difference between the gravesite of a rich person and a poor person in Harappan culture. And so, what that's kind of telling us is that these groups are probably a little bit, they have different social hierarchies. You don't have this very straight top down social hierarchy, whereas the king and the political elites and the priest class and the warrior class and the farmers and the laborers and then everybody else down here. So, that is an interesting and sort of unique hallmark. We don't see that the emphasis on wealth, on political power, on religious power here in Harappan culture. So that's what kind of makes it distinct from the other two. Now, the last group that we're talking about, or the last river valley that we're going to be talking about, is the area between the Yellow and the Yangtze River. So here we're talking about China, mainland China. And in a lot of ways, when we look at China, by the time that they start developing cities, or really more like urban villages, and there's a key difference in the Neolithic period. Neolithic China is kind of broken down between north and south. So, really, what we're looking at here is that unlike the Mesopotamians and Egyptians, there is really a sharp divide between the types of crops that grow in these two regions of China. In the south of China, they're mostly growing rice. In the north, they're mostly growing millet, which is another grain crop. So, their dedication to these two different types of crops, it kind of bleeds over into their lifestyles as well. What's interesting about China is that if we look back, you might remember me saying East Asia is the area where agriculture really first develops, and that is still true. And so it's somewhat perplexing that China doesn't really develop societies and settled cities as quickly as Mesopotamia or Egypt or India does. They kind of drag behind a little bit. Now, there are two sort of distinctive cultures that grow out in early Neolithic China. That is the Yangshao culture and the Longshan culture. The Yangshao culture grew around the sort of central reaches of the Yellow River, so right about 5,000 years ago is when we start to see um, evidence of this culture coming together and unifying. They started to organize into stable villages right around 5,000 years ago, but their villages only grew to about 10 to 14 acres big, and they were centered around just a public square, not some massive temple or building. So, while other societies in the rivers and floodplains of the world are building much bigger, what we tend to see is that the type of agriculture practiced by the Yangshao, this is not conducive to city building. The Yangshao people are slash and burn agriculturalists. If you're at all into the environment or know anything about that, this does not make for sustainable agriculture. You are eventually going to run into a problem where you've depleted your soil. And so they build these 10 to 14 acre villages that at some point in the future they're going to have to get up and move again. So it's not worth building a city. And that's because of the way they practice agriculture, the Yangshao culture. So mortality rates in Yangshao, China, is absolutely tremendous. You're seeing about 20% of the mortality rate in the society are children under the age of 15. We are finding almost no corpses over the age of 40. Just put very simply, life must have sucked here. It must have been really brutal and really miserable. And so they're opting to live in these smaller village arrangements because large settlements simply don't work for these particular groups. They have to do this because of their practicing slash and burn agriculture. And because they're always on the move, they're not really living in terms of like peak production levels. And so they're not really advancing the same way as some of the other societies we're seeing. Longshan culture is going to grow out of the remnants of Yang Shao culture. The Longshan culture has covered a much larger territory and it flourishes from about 3000 BC to 2000 BC. So they're centered around modern day Shandong province in China. Now, evidence of this culture is usually attributable to the discovery of a type of black, shiny, smooth pottery that they tend to produce. And it's found anywhere from Manchuria all the way down to Taiwan. So we know that they held sort of influence over a very wide territory. So the divination practices of later Chinese mystics is going to pretty much emerge from the Longshan culture. We find evidence of a lot of burned deer antlers and deer bones. That's probably how they started burning different bones in order to see how they cracked. And that's a form of religion. But I've given you some images as to how to look through, the different types of pottery there in China. One that distinguishes from another, Yang Shao and Long Shan. But what's important to know about China and what you got to take away from that discussion is that things are not happening at the same rate everywhere. China is undergoing a unique process of urbanization and development, and they really don't get to that point of building these massive cities. So that's something to be aware of there with China. The last subject I'm going to talk about is going to be very brief, I promise. It's just life outside the river valleys. And we've touched on it a little bit. It's important to remember that while we're really focused on cities because they leave a lot of historical evidence, there are a majority of people are not living in these cities. The majority of people at this time period are still hunter-gatherers, living in small clans outside of these urban areas. And what we tend to see there is that they highlight three different groups for you: people living in Anatolia or modern day Turkey, Europe, and the Aegean Sea, which is basically the area that will grow into the Greek Empire. So the people living in these regions are really not hitting the same level of achievement. They're not practicing the same sort of social arrangements. They're living in much smaller groups, mostly clan based living arrangements. There is a distinct warrior ethos, particularly in the Aegean and European societies. The authority is not vested in a religious figure so much or a political figure solely as much as it is a chieftain or a war chief who is successful in battle. Somebody can go and conquer, the next guy is over. That's the person who carries authority within these societies. So that's really within these groups, they're living in much smaller arrangements. They don't really practice widespread settled agriculture. And so these groups are really, they're not living in isolation, though. It's important to know that they are interacting with these large cities. As we saw with Sargon the Great, sometimes they're bandits from outside, as they would call them, or marauders. These are these groups living outside the river valley. They come in and attack. They hit the little societies on the periphery. They see cities as a threat to their way of life and as a threat to their existence. Other people work with the cities. They're not as technologically adept, and so they borrow technology from the cities. And so ultimately, what you're seeing is there's this constant back and forth, this balance between living in an urban center or living outside one of these urban centers. And so in Neolithic Europe, in the Neolithic Aegean, and in Anatolia, your book talks a little bit about what makes these areas unique. They are eventually going to start to follow the same process of settlement, agriculture, specialization, society building, city building, monument building, written languages, all these good things. They're going to get there eventually, but it's because they're interacting with these other large cities that had grown up first. And so when we're talking about the cities of the Neolithic period, we are focusing on life within the river basins of the Tigris and Euphrates, along the Nile, in the Yellow and Yangtze River in China, and the Indus River Valley in India. So that pretty much wraps up my lecture for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to send me an email or set up a Zoom meeting and we can meet that way. Take care.